this session is about harnessing the power of data to support staff mental health. With just a few sessions left, I'd like to reintroduce you to Catherine Courtney Evans, our Insight and Strategy Director, together with Barbara Jeffrey, who is a partner at the McKinsey Health Institute. Over to you both.
Thank you very much, Zoe, and lovely to be back again and talking about a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is about data and insight. And just reflecting on the session we heard earlier, I hope that this session will really help you bridge the gap in the dilemma of how to do measurement and what to measure by hearing some real data from both of our organisations. Could I just ask, Barbara, could you just introduce yourself and what you're bringing to the session today would be great. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. I'm Barbara Jeffrey. I'm a partner with McKinsey and also with McKinsey Health Institute, which is our nonprofit generating health research institute. And I'm here to talk today about some of the research and data that we've done around holistic health and burnout.
That's wonderful. Thank you. For me, this session is really going to add value, I hope, because we're both coming at data from a slightly different way, but I think you'll see as we talk, there's a lot of synergies in what we're going to share with you. And I'm absolutely delighted that Barbara's going to actually share with us the latest research, hot off the press. It's not due out until the 1st of November, so it's an absolute privilege to have first sight of this data. So can I just open the floor to you, Barbara, and would you like to share with us a little bit about the research and tell us some of the findings that the research is telling you?
Absolutely, I would be delighted. So we recently ran a survey across 30 countries to really understand the state of what we're calling holistic health across the globe. And we looked at 4 dimensions of health, including social, spiritual, physical, and mental health. And within that, we also did a bit of a deep dive on burnout. And so I wanted to share some of the results with you today. So you should see that actually on this basis, we looked at how people thought about their health. And the good news is that 57% of employees actually report good holistic health. And you'll see also the scores there for each of the individual 4 dimensions. And this, as I said, is aggregated across the data that we saw across 30 countries. However, what we also see is that employees can have good holistic health, but also show signs of burnout as well, which is interesting because we looked at the 2 different dimensions. And this is a little bit of a complex chart, so let me explain it. So what you see on the vertical axis is the degree to which someone shows burnout symptoms. So it's not a clinical definition of burnout, but at least showing those symptoms. So you will see at the top, the low burnout symptoms, and the bottom, the high burnout symptoms. And then on the horizontal axis, we've got the degree to which they're showing good holistic health versus suboptimal holistic health. And you'll see about half the participants are actually faring well. They've got low burnout symptoms and are well functioning. However, what we see is that group at the bottom, which we call stretching, which has got about 9% of people who show that they are well functioning from a holistic health perspective, but already showing high burnout symptoms. And then also conversely in the other group, to the flip side, you've got the managing group, which is around 30% of people who actually show low burnout symptoms, but also not great, holistic health. And then that group, which we're really worried about, which we're calling the drowning, which are showing high burnout symptoms and really poor holistic health. So it depends how you look at this chart. You could say, 50% of people are faring well, but we also see it as an opportunity to say, actually, we need to move more people from poor health to kind of more optimal health as well. And so one of the things that we were keen to explore is how do you do that? What we have done is we looked at a large number of drivers behind this, and we looked at what we called stressors, which are things that cause stress to people in the organization versus enablers, which are there to promote the more positive outcomes. And we looked at them at kind of individual, job, team, and organizational level. So some of the things that you'll see in the individual things are adaptability and self-efficacy, in job autonomy versus work pressure, in team psychological safety versus toxic workplace behavior, and in organization, access to health resources, etc. And we looked at a combination of health-related and work-related outcomes. And I'll talk a little bit about the results of that as well. But that just hopefully gives you a little bit of a flavour of the research and that we'll be publishing in November. But I know, Catherine, you've also been doing a lot of your own research and data as well. So I was keen to kind of get your take on the This Can Happen index data and what findings you're seeing.
Thank you, Barbara. And it's really interesting listening to you talk, because as you're talking, I'm seeing so many synergies what I'm about to go through, which is wonderful. So what I wanted to do was just start with a bit of an overview about how I look at data. And I've stolen this infographic with pride because I really love it, because I think it's so simple. And listening to the first session, I felt a real sense that people get a bit overwhelmed by data and don't really know what to do with it. And for us, when we look at data, we want to sort it, we want to find a pattern, but then we want to think about what the story is that the data is showing, share the insight, and ultimately you collect data because you want to understand it and potentially make some changes or communicate what you're doing. So for us, that is the way I view data. And the context of showing you this is because that's how I want to talk about the data from our index. Could you move the slide on for me, please? Thank you. So first of all, I just wanted to set the context of the index. So Barbara very eloquently talked about the stresses and enablers and what the data was showing from their survey. The way the index works, it's focused purely on mental well-being. But what it does is it looks at the strength of alignment between what the employees are saying that they need, but also the understanding of the organisation. So it's really interesting to think that against the context of what Barbara was talking about, because we can share some of the employees' views in the two sets of data, but with our data as well, we've got the organisational view overlaid on top of that. So if you were a leader of an organisation, you were making change, you might maybe think differently about what you're about to do if you understood that there was quite a large gap between what you thought the employees felt and what the employees were actually feeling. It might make you maybe communicate it differently or apply what you're going to do differently. This chart that I've got on the screen is our overall data for 2023. So we've amalgamated all of the people that have been through our index, anonymised it and pulled it all together. And for me, I think the important thing that I want to focus on is that there's actually been some subtle shifts in the data since we looked at this in 2022. And for this session, I'm only going to focus on the more negative area of the index because I think it just is more interesting for this session. And what I was going to do is just look at, first of all, where's the largest gaps. Could you click on for me, please? So what I've done on this slide is I've just literally cut that chart in half. So the top box you've got here is where there's the biggest alignment gaps between what the organisation thinks the employees want and how the employees are actually feeling. So all of these scores are low employee scores. So they're all areas where employees would like something different to be done about these questions. And what's really interesting, first of all, is one of the biggest changes that's coming through for our index is this time last year, work-life balance was over to the right. So it was a high-performing area that both the employees and the organisation were saying we're in a pretty good place. And over the last 12 months, that score has moved from the right over to the left-hand side. And what that's saying is that the workplace is still thinking that it's a high score and employees are happy, but actually employees are struggling much more with work-life balance than they were this time last year. And I think thinking about some of the sessions we've heard today, particularly the keynote at the beginning, where we were talking about burnout and the symptoms and, some of the causes and the mismatch, maybe some of that is coming into this. The second really important one is around workplace pressure. Now, this has always been a low score in the study, but it's got even lower this time round, moving to 2023. And one for me that's really interesting as well, that we're going to hopefully do some more work on, is around psychological safety. And again, that has moved from both parties, employer and organisations, saying it's a low score, up into that box where employers aren't recognising that employees at the moment are feeling that there's work to be done around psychological safety. So I'm going to hand back to Barbara now. So obviously we've talked a little bit about both our data sets, and I think there's some quite compelling messages. From your point of view, what interventions are you seeing that might work or might support organisations that might be experiencing some of these data themes that we've talked through?
I made a classic mistake of being on mute. So as you know, Catherine, we've talked, and I love the research that you've been doing, and it's very complementary to the ones that we've been doing. We also did our mental health survey last year as well, and this work is really building on that. So as we thought about burnout versus holistic health and this sort of impact across the two things, we saw what drives burnout symptoms is actually different to what drives holistic health. So when you look at what drives burnout symptoms, it's very much some of those things that you were talking about, really around the team and the job level. So when we look at that data, you'll see it's pretty compelling, actually, that the workplace stresses, drive the burnout symptoms kind of 7 times more than the enablers. And the top drivers of those burnout symptoms include toxic workplace behavior, role ambiguity, and role conflict, actually, which I think is really interesting. Work pressure is up there too. Whereas when you look at the enablers, they're 14 times more predictive of holistic health than the stressors. And you'll see it's a much more holistic picture, actually, across all of the different 4 dimensions. And the top enablers predicting holistic health outcomes are some of those in the individual bucket, which is self-efficacy and adaptability. And interestingly, also in the team, feelings of belonging, meaning, and yes, psychological safety. So very consistent, actually. And so for us, a good starting point is working on the things that minimize burnout. So really just working on those kind of toxic workplace behaviors and some of those stressors, but ultimately over time moving to much more holistic health in terms of what people can actually do about it. And I'm just really excited that we've been able to actually disaggregate, like you have done, the different drivers, and to see very similar results. I actually think it's really powerful. But I know you've been working with your clients as well, and would love to hear as to what they've been doing and what they found has worked versus just what our research tells us.
Thank you, Barbara. I mean, when we've been working with our clients, our starting point is always trying to understand what data that they have in-house currently, because we don't believe you should reinvent the wheel when you're looking at data. You should use what you've got. And often a client will say to me, well, I don't really have any data in-house. It's not something I've got to hand. But then you kind of have a bit more of a conversation. Often the data is there, and we heard it earlier on, but it's in silos, or it's owned by someone else, or the technology systems are there, but they're hard to access, or the technology systems don't even talk to each other. So sometimes just making use of what data is in-house can be really challenging. And our view on that is really just use whatever data you can, because anything that adds to the story of what you might have a gut instinct that's happening within the business is powerful. I think the challenge lots of our clients have at the moment is they're getting pushed a lot more for proving return on investment. So if there's been something put in place and, they're going back and putting that budget in for another year, it can be really hard to say, well, I can prove the outcomes, or I can prove a measurable difference. And also I can show that your investment that you've put is actually making a difference. And that's where I think the data bit comes into its own, particularly around measurement and measuring change, because that can be really powerful. We talked about baseline measurement earlier on, and actually once you've got that one kind of measurement in place, whatever it looks like, if you then do it again, hopefully you can see some change. And even if it's only on one metric that is a really important one for your organization, that could be pretty powerful based on what you've decided to measure. I think the other thing, thinking about data and interventions, is that if you're doing anything around data and measurement, it's really important to think about the people that you've asked, why you've asked it, but really what you're going to do with that data. And lots of clients sometimes forget the bit of, thanking people for taking part in research. And I know we had lots of questions earlier about falling response rates on surveys and people not wanting to engage. And often when I hear that, I think, well, did you tell them thank you, first of all, for doing the survey? And did you actually tell them what their results had meant? One of the big low performers again in the index is this call to action. Employees want to see something happening as a result of their feedback. And you and I both know if you tell someone something and think that they've listened and they do nothing about it, you might try again a second time. Probably by the third time, you won't listen, you won't do it again, will you? You think, actually, what's the point? Why should I bother? So I think it's really important that anything you do around data reporting, you do feed it back, and maybe, you know, feed it back a couple of times in different ways to make sure that people can consume that information in a way that's right for them. I think the final thing that comes to mind talking about this topic is sometimes it's really hard to be honest that actually there's some things that you can't change. And I'm thinking here around work pressure. We work with a lot of organisations that know that work pressure is an issue. But for whatever reason, the structure or the culture of the business makes it very hard to change the thing that's driving the pressure. And, you know, I'm thinking maybe of the legal scenario here where the way that they work and the model means that actually people are put under a lot of pressure, particularly from, you know, graduates inwards. And actually that is the business model. So, and that's what's causing some of the pressure. So to change that is really hard. So actually it's about thinking about, well, I can't potentially change the business model, but actually there are other things I can do to recognise pressure, but in a way that obviously doesn't cost the business huge amounts of money. So that was just another thought that was going through my head when I was looking at the data and thinking about interventions. I think it's important as leaders to be honest and to sometimes to be a little bit brave. And someone asked the question earlier, well, should we ask the question if we don't want to hear the answers? Well, aren't you better off knowing the answers and knowing what to do with it than, you know, assuming you know the answers? Because the index quite clearly shows that on some of those things, the assumptions are wrong. There's some really big gaps.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Just a quick response on that before we head to questions. I think on the value case, actually, one of the things that we've seen a lot is people really focusing on the downside case, essentially. So, you know, on absenteeism, attrition, presenteeism. Actually, we see that being, we've done a bit of a sizing of the business case, at least for the UK, and we saw that it was somewhere between £4,000 to £12,000 per employee, so 137 to 370 billion for the UK economy. And actually, interestingly enough, the downside case is less than half of it. It's actually the upside case around attraction, retention, productivity is far, far bigger. And so really, as it kind of reinforces, it is important to really focus on moving people, but it's not necessarily about spending more, it's about spending better and really focusing on those interventions that really make a difference and moving people to more optimal health. So.
No, absolutely. And that's a very good point. And just thinking about return on investment, Barbara, have you seen any examples where people have done something that you thought that was a really creative, great idea to kind of, you know, show the power of data in your experience?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's actually worked really well, so some people have actually tried to attach metrics to things or done sort of natural experiments where they've used one group and then a control group and then done it 3 months later. But actually, I think I politically applaud those companies that have just gone in and actually said, you know what, it's a bit like digital. Actually, we built all of these business cases around digital. We knew it was the right thing to do. And then we actually saw the return later as well. So I think you can definitely build a business case for it. But there's also something which is actually, if you believe it's the right thing to do, you will see the return, and it should come through on things like engagement scores and other measures. But it's really, I do think actually when you look at some of the business cases for digital, they are so aware of kind of what the end result finally was. So I would just encourage people to just go for it.
No, absolutely great advice. I was just having a look at some of the questions coming in, which are really interesting. And maybe we start at the top one, which is, we're a very small company with limited financial resources. What advice can you give us on how to use the power of research and data on a tight budget? Now, that's a lovely question because, you know, budgets are increasingly under pressure, aren't they? Small companies or large companies. So maybe you want to go first, and then I can think of some other words to support as well.
Yeah, so as we said, I think the first place that I would start is really focused on that toxic workplace behaviour. When we did our survey around mental health specifically, as Catherine mentioned, that piece around psychological safety is really important. And so we saw that around 60% of the variance of the negative outcomes around burnout were specifically explainable by toxic workplace behaviour. So if there's one thing that you do, it's encourage your managers to be great managers. And I think anyone can do that, you know, irrespective of the size of the organisation. So that's where I would start.
Yeah, no, and that's really good advice, Barbara, because one of the things I was thinking about is that listening doesn't cost a huge amount of money. And I think organisations sometimes don't listen properly. You know, it's very easy to say I've heard and I've taken it on board, but actual proper listening and taking time to consider and to then put an action plan together, you know, it doesn't cost a huge amount of money to do that, or, you know, talk to the line managers for potentially to do the listening as well. And thinking about toxic workplace behaviour, sometimes softer exercises like listening exercises can actually give you some of those gems, can't they, in the words of the employees, to give you a sense of what to do.
Absolutely.
Another question that's come in is around senior management buy-in as well, and building data into senior strategy and kind of giving it a focus. And the question is, how can you get support for using data when you're building a strategy?
So I think it's a great question and really important, because I think the more that you have data, well, you're preaching to the converted. I mean, this whole session is around data.
Two data people, yeah.
Exactly. But where I would start is actually with the CFOs, because actually one of the things that we found is that if you can convince your CFO of the value of this, suddenly, you know, budgets get it unlocked, etc. And actually, one way into that is there's a couple of ways into it. One is, you know, developing a bit of the business case around that to try things and then try and put metrics against it and then try and see what the return is. The other one is to try and link it a bit to the ESG agenda. So some organizations have specific ring-fenced budget for ESG. And actually, for me, the S is now starting to be redefined a bit to also include health measures as well. So that's another creative thing that we've seen people do. And I definitely see a shift in the CFOs towards their willingness to actually start investing in this, because they see that actually large institutional investors, but also private money, are actually now starting to make decisions on the basis of how well organizations are doing in ESG. S&P have now started including health as part of their ESG scores. And so I do think that's another way into it.
No, absolutely, and that's exactly what I was thinking as well. I was thinking the lines of it might not just be the CFO. If you can get any senior sponsor that's prepared to talk the talk, you know, sitting around the board table and say, but I'd like to see some data on this, or I'd like to see some change over time. I think that's really powerful, isn't it? To make sure that the word gets discussed and people talk about data at all levels.
Fully agree. I think the key is having a senior sponsor. You need a senior sponsor.
Absolutely. This is a nice question, thinking about the future for 2024. Someone has asked, which areas of employee mental health would you both like to see further research into as we move into 2024?
Well, Catherine, why don't you start with that one, actually?
Yeah, that's a good one. I would like to see more research into some quite meaty topics. I'd like to see some research around people that have caring responsibilities in the workplace, and that's really broad, because the more we talk to people and the more we talk to our clients, caring responsibilities are often hidden, and you might be coming in and doing a job but looking after a parent that's got Alzheimer's, for example, or you've got, you know, you're just a mum looking after kids that have their own difficulties. And I think sometimes people forget that actually when you come into work, you can have a whole load of things that are going on that can affect your performance that you might need extra support for. So I'd like something, you know, think about a topic like that going forward as well. What about you, Barbara?
So I'd like to know what interventions actually work.
Yeah, that's another good one.
And actually some data behind that.
Yeah.
So we've done a bunch of looking at sort of academic research. We've got, you know, we've had a look across what companies are doing broadly, but actually there's very little data on, we've tried this is the results that we got, you know, in a much more systematic way. And I think, you know, I would really encourage you know, I understand that companies don't want to share data and what they're doing, right? I completely get that. But I just think it would be lovely if we could start getting some data around actually what interventions work and what actually doesn't work, and where are people wasting their money. And I think that that would be my wish for the new year.
No, that'd be lovely. And then there could be some great case studies, couldn't there, to help people actually see some examples of what's really worked and some best practice in there.
Exactly. So if anyone in this group is up for sharing.
I'm sure people are saying, but I've got a great idea in the background.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah. Another lovely question is thinking about we were talking about the topic of pressure, and someone has asked, how much do you think that the pressure to return to the office might now be contributing to the mismatch of the scores and work-life balance? And that's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because I know recently there's been quite a lot talk about people not, well, and for a better word, mandating certain number of days back in the office, post COVID and the change. So what would you think on that one?
Actually, really interesting. We didn't put this in the slides, but we actually had a look at kind of working arrangements and the impact of that on people's holistic health. And the most important thing actually was the choice.
Yeah.
Actually, and it's not about necessarily having full flexibility, right? In terms of everyone coming in at sort of random days. But I do think one of the winning models that we're seeing is where people have choice and they're being able to co-locate for specific things and activities, but actually they have a choice and some flexibility around when do they come in versus not. So a bit more the structured hybrid model seems to be the best one for health. But we'll be able to share a bit more about that in November when the research comes out and we finish digging through the data.
No, absolutely. A lovely question also about line management. You mentioned line managers earlier. Is there any data that you've got to support the importance of the line managers in actually influencing the mental well-being of their people?
Absolutely. So actually, if we can go back to the slide, but so if we could go back to the factors slide, but all of that stuff that you saw in terms of the importance of teams, I think the line managers has such a huge responsibility for creating that sense of belonging, meaning, psychological safety.
Yeah.
And I think actually for me, my big takeaway coming out of all of this is one, it's really up to us as leaders, frankly, to look after our teams. But secondly, the number of people that we saw showing symptoms of burnout, last year it was 25, now it's around 22. That means probably every one of us has someone on our team showing quite high signs of burnout. And I found that really shocking the first time I heard of it. So I think it's about our responsibility as leaders to look after our teams and just to make sure that, we all can do what we can to look after the individuals in our teams. And I think, yes, you can put out organizational training and capability building for line managers, but I also think it's on us to look after, the teams that we're in too.
No, absolutely. And I was reflecting on some of the data around line management for the index. One of the kind of the pieces of data that, again, we'd like to do a little bit more looking at is why employees are rating the line managers more highly than the organisation is. Because obviously the line manager is a really key role, and it's a role where the more you hear about it, the more these individuals are needing to do. And if, you get a sense if the organisation isn't recognising the importance of those individuals and not giving them the right skills or enabling them or letting them do things that they know that it needs to be done, it's an even harder job, isn't it? Regardless if you've got the right skills as an individual. So I think that's a nice bit of feedback as well for organisations to recognise the importance of the line manager, but also give them the right skills.
Fully agree. And I do think it is that combination of, making sure that each individual line manager feels supported, but also you have that senior management sponsorship. And I do think actually one of the things that you can invest in, as you saw, as you move people towards more optimal health, is that sort of self-efficacy and that self-reliance. And you have to invest in your line managers because, if someone shows up feeling bad themselves, you can be pretty sure they're going to have a pretty toxic, impression on their team. So the more that we can do to support that group, it's actually going to have a disproportionate impact on the rest of the organization.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very sad to say we've got to the end of our session, Barbara. I could go on talking to you for ages, give loads of fascinating information. Can I just thank you very much for sharing the research with us and for spending the time, and to thank all our audience for listening. And we'll let you know when obviously the full report comes out. And if anyone wants more information on the index, do please get in touch. But thank you very much indeed.
It was a real pleasure. Always a pleasure, Catherine. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara.
And my thanks as well, Catherine and Barbara. I can see from the chat box so many people really interested in this session. So thank you both very much indeed. And yes, data is definitely something high on our list of priorities. So thank you to you both. And our next conference on the 7th of November for the Asia audience and US, Catherine will be presenting more findings from our index. So we look forward to that. The next session coming up in a moment is on divorce grief. So stay tuned.